All right, so then I'm going to introduce both of our speakers. So today, like I said, we have two winners of the AWIARE and Levett Foundation Grant from 2019. We have Heather Draskovich, who's a current MA student at the University of South Florida, and we also have Kendall Jackson, who's a PhD candidate at the University of South Florida. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have Heather go first. So I'll introduce her first and get her started, and then we will go to Kendall. And then again, we'll hold all questions until the end. And I realize now that I did not introduce myself. I totally missed that, so I'm sorry. But my name is Cassie Kemp, and I am the current president of CGCAS. And just welcome. We're very excited to have you here. And I'll just hop right in. All right, so Heather is going to be speaking first. Heather's talk is entitled Rethinking Settlement Patterns at the Weedon Island Site. And Heather Draskovich is, like I said, a master's student in the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Florida. And her research focuses on landscape use on a site level scale around Tampa Bay. Her master's research centers around the pre-Columbian settlement patterning and use of the Weedon Island site. So I'm going to stop sharing, Heather, so that you can share your screen.
Right on. All right, good to go?
And we're good to go, Heather, whenever you're ready.
All right, so as Cassie said, I'm Heather Draskovich. I'm a master's student at USF. I thought that since we usually have our lectures at Weedon Island, you might miss it. So I'm gonna fill that void for you and talk about Weedon with you tonight. So I'm looking at settlement patterns. So if you're not from the area, Weedon Island is located in Pinellas County, Florida, on the west side of Tampa Bay. And it's a Weedon Island period ceremonial center. Not only that, it's one of the largest and most famous of these ceremonial centers, but unfortunately, despite this distinction, it is very poorly dated. So further on this, some background of the site, only about 10% of the over 1,000-acre site has been investigated archaeologically, starting in 1879 with S.T. Walker from the Smithsonian. He was documenting about 20 sites along the west side of Tampa Bay, with Weedon Island being one of them. He called it Pappy's Bayou Mound because Riviera Bay used to be called Pappy's Bayou. And then up until 1923, 1924, we had J.W. Fuchs and Matthew Sterling with others come from the Smithsonian to document the site, and they mapped a lot of the features. More importantly, they worked in the burial mound up here. You might see this brown section in the north. From this, obviously, they got human remains and other artifacts, but more importantly, they have ceramic vessels they recovered that were helpful for Gordon Willey in the 40s to make the Weedon Island Ceramic Complex. So it bears its name, even though the ceramics necessarily weren't made here, but there was the first of their discovery. We've also had compliance work happen out at the preserve, shown by these pink diamonds and light blue diamonds. So CRM companies come ahead of development and make sure that cultural resources aren't being impacted by development. And if they are, they can record those things first. So we have like work where the cultural center was built, the AWIARE station, and then also Weedon Drive's construction and when it moved a little bit. So we've also had work by Jonathan Dean and Brent Wiseman with Jean Lambert and others in 2004, shown by shovel testing in these dark blue diamonds, and also these black and white circles are cores done by Lambert for her MA thesis. Coming from that, they kind of just did like a reconnaissance survey of the entire preserve. And then following 2007, Dr. Arthur of USF St. Pete started excavating here in the southeast, which continues today. And then one of his prior students, Charlene O'Donnell, did her master's thesis on a pit feature from one of his units. So we have dates from that. And then we have AWIARE trenches just to the south in 2013. And also 2013, we have Dr. Sampson from University of Michigan, doing the domestic and like village context, which are these red squares over here to the right. So as you can see, we've had a lot of work done in the past century, but they've been in very small portions of this extremely large site. And further, we've only had 42 radiocarbon dates for the entirety of the site, with 38 of those coming solely from the Safety Harbor component, which is presumed to be spatially restricted, and also later. 25 of those 38 coming from Sampson's work, 9 coming from Dr. Arthur, 4 from O'Donnell, which leaves the other 4 dates for the rest of the sites. We have 3 from Dean and then 1 date from Sears in the north. So I kind of wanted to remedy that with my thesis. A big part of my work was shovel testing. So what I did was I determined 8 areas of the site for shovel testing. These are previously uninvestigated or just areas that were lacking in datable materials. So areas 1 and 6 wasn't actually able to investigate because 1 was just a push pile from airport runways, and area 6 was like environmental hazards, so I didn't want to work up there. But the other 6 areas, I was able to conduct 30 shovel tests, with 20 of them being positive and 10 negative. So areas 5, 2, and 8, were positive for cultural materials, while 3, 4, and 7 were negative. And you might think that I'm only interested in these positive shovel tests, but I'm just as interested in the negative ones because it shows that people were not occupying those areas of the site. And that's just as important to know, is where they were occupying. So I put this slide in because it kind of represents my journey for my thesis fieldwork, with the top row being pictures from the first field season, where for the first 3 or 4 weeks, we found absolutely nothing. We were digging a negative shovel test, just dirt. And maybe the 4th or 5th week, we found our first 2 flakes here on the left, which are very small and seem insignificant, but we were super stoked to find those. And then thankfully after that, we found these really nice lithics, corals, and cherts, a possible start of a point here, the 4th from the right or left, which is super awesome to find these things, these lithics, but I can't really date them for the purposes of my thesis. So, I mean, I was excited, but not as much as I could be. And then also we found this large Kodak photo solution bottle in the middle woods, where admittedly we were lost and I had no idea where I was, but that's just from like a historic artifact from when they were shooting movies out at Weedon Island. And then the bottom row is kind of more indicative of my summer field season, where it's super hot and I'm hoping not to have a repeat of the previous season. But after like the 2nd or 3rd week, we finally found this awesome bone bead, and I knew, like, all right, we're on it now. And we have these shell hammers, obviously evidence of occupation. And then we're finally finding what I'm calling the good stuff, which is our sooted pottery sherds and terrestrial mammal bones, which I know I can date and try to understand the chronology of the site. So besides doing this shovel testing, I also looked at 2 collections from previous investigations. One from the Cedars collection, which was housed at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville. And the other is the Dean collection, which was housed at the AWIARE station. From this, I got 7 new dates, 4 from Sears, 3 from Dean. And they kind of coincide with what you would think I would find. I had the dates from Sears, obviously in the northern part of the site, which coincide with the Weedon Island period. And then I have 2 more from Dean, which are from the northern part of the site. One of them is kind of anomalous. It's a Safety Harbor date, which I kind of talk about that date later. It might be just specialized use of the land. And then I have 1 date from Dean that's just north of that Safety Harbor component, which is actually a Weedon Island date, which is also might be a specialized use and not occupation. So for my own testing, I was able to obtain 4 new dates. 1 in area 5, which is just north of that Safety Harbor component, which obviously the date you can see is a Safety Harbor date, so that's consistent. And then area 8 was up in the north part of the site, where I did find the middle to late Weedon Island, which I was expecting to find. So 11 new dates. So after this, I took these 11 dates and matched up with the other 42 and able to do some Bayesian modeling to find out phases of occupation of the site. So before I did the entire site, first I broke it down into 4 loci, depending on like concentrations of dates. And this I'll go through each. Locus 1 was broken down into 4 phases, with the first being consistent with the Weedon Island period. Second being consistent also with the Weedon Island period, but we have a lot of dates from this phase, so it's probably the most intensive occupation was occurring at this time. Going to phase 3 is consistent with the later Weedon Island period and early Safety Harbor periods. And then the 4th phase likely represents the limited habitation of this area of the site, because that's that one Safety Harbor date that's up here in the north, which I think might just be specialized use of that land where people were residing probably elsewhere during the Safety Harbor. Going into the second locus, which is just north of that Safety Harbor component, there's only 2 dates and they're very widely separated by time and space. So I had 1 date on this left side of the polygon, one date from the right side of the polygon. But this indicates at least two distinct occupations, one in the early Weedon Island period and one in the early Safety Harbor period. But you would definitely need a lot more dates to try to understand how this land was used and like when people were there and occupying it. That brings us to locus 3, which if you look in the Dean report, he refers to this area as Three Ogres Mound. So I'll refer to it that way the same from here on out. This is broken into 6 phases, where the first phase is indicating occupation in the early Safety Harbor period. Following in the second phase, we have occupation in the middle Safety Harbor period. Obviously, there's probably a break in between these occupations. Going into the third phase, dates overlap pretty well with the second phase, meaning there might be just shorter or either continuous occupation or just a shorter break in between occupations. Going into phase 4, there's only a slight overlap in the dates, so this is probably indicating a larger gap between occupations. Phase 5, again, slight overlap, but it does indicate that the occupation of this portion of the site went from the middle Safety Harbor into the later Safety Harbor period, so that's important to know. And then last phase 6 indicates that occupation of this portion of the site went from the late Safety Harbor into the early colonial era. Finally, in locus 4, just south of locus 3, this is referred to as Jeans Mound Complex. This has 5 phases of occupation, with the first indicating that people were occupying this portion of the site at the end of the Weedon Island period and into the early Safety Harbor. And then phase 2 is indicating that people are still occupying this area during the early Safety Harbor period, but there's a considerable overlap between the previous phase, suggesting the occupation might have been more continuous, and if not, then there's just shorter breaks in between. Going into phase 3, there's a lot of overlap from the previous phase again, suggesting more or less continuous occupation. Into phase 4, we don't have so much of an overlap, so this is suggesting that there's probably a long break in occupation of this area between phase 3 and 4. And last, phase 5, there's some overlap with the end of phase 4, but it's not really enough to assume that there's continuous occupation at this time. So once we modeled those 4 areas, it took the beginning and ending dates of each locus and did a site-wide model, which went into 9 phases of occupation. So for the first phase of occupation, it's in the early to middle Weedon Island period. You can see people are concentrated here in the north of the site. We do have this anomalous date down here, which I'm not really including. So I will say people were most likely concentrated in the north. Going into phase 2, still occupying the north part of the site. Mostly, we do have another date down here. Not quite sure what to make of that. As I said, that's the locus that was separated a lot by time and space. And there's a little bit of an overlap timing-wise from the first phase, so there was most likely a break in occupation between those two. Moving into phase 3, this indicates that people were occupying not only the northern portion of the site, but also the southeast Safety Harbor kind of area at the end of the Weedon Island and beginning of the early Safety Harbor period. And there's a huge overlap between phases 2 and 3, so it's less likely that there was a break in occupation, and if there was, it was just a lot shorter. Into the next phase, this indicates early Safety Harbor period occupation. It seems like the people were predominantly down here by the Three Ogres Mound. We do have this anomalous date in the north, but like I said, I think that's just specialized use of the land and people are residing down here in the southeast. It's an extremely short phase, it's only 10 to 20 years long, and there's a lot of overlap between the previous phase. So this might suggest continuous occupation or, of course, short breaks. Your next phase, let me move this over a little bit. Next phase, people are just concentrated in the southeast at the Three Ogres Mound and Jean Mound complexes. It's early Safety Harbor still, again, a short phase and a lot of overlap with the previous phase, probably suggesting continuous occupation or just extremely short breaks in between. And then phase 6, still, again, early Safety Harbor, another really short phase with a lot of overlap from the previous. So it's kind of showing that the period from 81,000 to about 1300, there was most likely a continuous occupation, so phases 3 to 6. Moving into phase 7, people are still concentrated down at the Three Ogres Mound and still Jeans Mound complex, but there's not a lot of overlap from the previous phase, so there's most likely a break in occupation between these two phases. And then going into phase 8, it's likely that they were still down at Jeans Mound Complex, but we just don't have the data to support it. So I will say they were still at the Three Ogres Mound Complex, a little bit to the north, in the middle safety harbor period. There's not much overlap from the previous occupation, so there's likely a break. And then the final phase, again, both complexes are represented, so it indicates that people were occupying this part of the site in the late safety harbor and into the colonial era. So this might also still be a continuous occupation from 8 to 9. So another part of my thesis dealt with this time period, like time interval, AD 400 to 700, which is the vernal minimum, which is a climatic event kind of linked to climate change like drought and lower sea levels. And my advisor and his colleagues have kind of caught on to this pattern of settlement and restructuring and reorganization that's happened throughout the Weedon Island cultural area, looking at the inland coastal plain of Georgia at Kolomoki, and then Garden Patch, Shell Mound, and Crystal River on the Florida Peninsula, and even Bayshore homes on the other side of Pinellas County, all seem to have this pattern of reorganization during the vernal minimum. So my thesis was kind of trying to get at finding out if Weedon Island fits into this pattern. If so, then this pattern goes from south to north and goes from the Gulf Coast of Florida and spreads north through the Weedon Island culture area. From this research, it does seem to find or show that the occupation of Weedon Island did intensify during the middle phases, like I was saying, 3 to 6, between 80, 1000, and 1300, which indicates that major expansion likely began around the late 800s. This timing is consistent with this regional model of settlement reorganization, which is super interesting and may situate the Weedon Island site as one of the latest and southernmost examples of this pattern. That's all I got. I have thanks for the Levett Foundation for funding this research, my advisor, Dr. Pecan, for his advising and support, AWIARE and CGCAS for putting this talk on, the Florida Museum of Natural History for facilitating research, Duke Energy for letting me work on their land, USF Anthropology and the USF Field School students for being awesome and putting in hard work out there in the heat. And I'll just leave you with 2 pictures of the best and worst of Weedon. On the left, all these horrible briars they have to go through to get down to these beautiful views that not a lot of people see. That's all I got. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Heather. So again, if you have any questions for Heather, just stick them in the chat with her name, and then we'll get to them at the end. And then we'll move on to our second speaker, and that is Kendall Jackson. His talk is called Searching for Ancient Seascapes, Preliminary Results of Ongoing Geoarchaeological Investigations in the Tampa Bay Estuary. And like I said, Kendall Jackson is a Ph.D. candidate in applied anthropology at the University of South Florida. His research focuses on paleo-environment and how past societies have shaped the trajectory of long-term ecological processes. His dissertation research is focused on understanding the roles that ancestral Native American societies played in the establishment and transformation of nearshore estuarine ecosystems across the late Holocene. And that's Kendall, and so we'll just pass it on to you, Kendall.
Great. Let me see if I can share my screen properly. Okay, all good? Great.
Okay.
So thanks to y'all. Thanks, Heather. That was really fascinating. And thanks to y'all for tuning in to listen to our talks. And especially thanks to AWIARE and the Levett Foundation for making my research possible. So my talk is all about ongoing research in Tampa Bay. That is very much ongoing, so you'll have to cut me a little bit of a break at 3 different areas of Tampa Bay Estuary. Yeah, and here they are. So northernmost in Upper Tampa Bay, in an area called Cabbage Head Bayou. And then on the Pinellas Peninsula, I'm also working at Ross Island, which is sort of the easternmost or easternmost portion of Weedon Island Preserve. And then also down south of Ruskin here at the famous Cockroach Key mound site in Cockroach Bay. So all of these sites are situated in dense mangrove forest where they rise above the mangrove peat to support unique vegetation communities, or sometimes just, Brazilian pepper trees. But the mangroves shroud the topographic relief and sort of the morphological complexity of the mounded shellworks that were made in the ancient past. All of these sites seem to have been constructed between 2,000 and 1,000 years ago. Here's Jamie Rogers standing on top of one of them. Also, don't litter. The mangrove forests around these sites are just full of plastic trash. So here you can see just how well the current mangrove forests sort of hide these shell mound sites. This mangrove shoreline fringe is hiding a section of a shell mound that's just about 5 meters tall and is only about 100 feet or so from this shoreline. So it's really amazing how well hidden they are. And the vegetation on these islands often makes it very difficult to map them from the ground. But using light detection and ranging data, which is, Heather's already shown you some of that. I'll show you some LiDAR maps, some light detection and ranging maps as well. So here's one of Cockroach Key down south of Ruskin. And you can see this rather tall mound complex. It's 11 meters tall. That rises above the high tide line in the mangrove forest. And here is the Double Branch Bay site and the Cabbage Head Bayou site, left and right, here in Upper Tampa Bay Nature Preserve, just south of Oldsmar. You can see sort of a linear shell ridge, and then Cabbage Head Bayou site has this fascinating sort of semicircular shape with a flat mangrove forest in the center, and then a fun small shell mound in the middle that we excavated. And then of course, Ross and Gouge Islands at Weedon Island Preserve, they're a little bit more prominent from the water because they're ancient dunes, and these are about the tallest point is about 5 meters above mean sea level. So visiting these sites, you get to know all too well the modern estuarine wetland environments that surround and sort of encompass them. Sometimes get to know them more than you'd like. But we know from sea level reconstruction research, particularly a new sea level curve from the mouth of the Little Manatee River in Tampa Bay, that when these sites were built and occupied during the middle to late woodland period, sea level was considerably lower, probably between 70 centimeters and a meter below present, which doesn't seem like a whole lot on face value, but if you spend a whole ton of time, or any time really, out on Tampa Bay, in nearshore Tampa Bay, and in the winter especially, you find out rather quickly that 50 or 70 centimeters or a meter of water is a lot of water, and a sea level drop of 70 centimeters to a meter would expose really vast areas of the bay as terrestrial. So one of my major research questions, it's a very basic one, is what ecosystems, what habitats were encompassing these archaeological sites at the time they were built and occupied, and how did they change over time? A second goal of my research is to understand better how the construction of ancient shellworks altered sort of the development of the estuary, right? Because we're talking about flat sand and mud environments without very much structure, right? And hard structures tend to organize ecosystems in estuaries like this. So constructing shellworks like this is bound to have pretty dramatic effects within the ecosystem. So I'm also looking for those. So I'm looking at these questions with three different methods, field methods, I should say. The first of which is archaeological excavation, and we're mostly excavating small test units, or we'd call them shovel tests. They're 50 centimeters square, and they go down about a meter a meter to 120 centimeters. And they're small by many archaeological standards, but they're also great because I'm working in state park land or on aquatic preserve land, and these sites are mostly preserved. So it's important to conserve them and not, you know, just dig everything up. At Cockroach Key, we've been able to make positive use of some historical, call them illicit digging pits that are sort of all over that island and other islands in the bay, where people have gone and just dug willy-nilly without much control. But fortunately for us, we're able to sort of, you can see on the left, we can square these pits off to make a clean profile. And then we can use them to excavate our shovel test and to access greater depths. We can dig considerably deeper, extending from the floor of some of these pits. For instance, this test, shovel test 2 at Cockroach Key, we were able to get down about 170 centimeters. And that is the only reason we were able to access these fire features you see here at the base of the pit. Elsewhere, let's see if this works. Elsewhere, we're digging excavation units where the cultural deposits extend well under the sea level, even below low tide. And in these situations, we carry a pump through the mangrove forest into the shell mound sites, and we set it up and we keep excavating. It's not always easy or super neat, but we do get good samples of cultural materials that were deposited when sea level was considerably lower, which is great. So at the shovel tests, we're screening with 1/8 inch mesh so that not only do we recover larger artifacts like this large pottery sherd from Cockroach Key or these fighting conch shell tools from Cockroach Key, but we're also finding very small artifacts in dietary remains, like these small vertebrae, small tiny gastropods that are probably incidentally captured, and then also very informative fish remains like these otoliths or fish ear bones. This one's from a catfish, and this one, Heather can correct me, but I think it's sea trout. Yeah, okay, good. So another method, other than we can't just excavate everywhere, but we want to know what's beneath the surface. So we also take percussion cores, which is a fancy way of saying pounding a 3-inch diameter pipe into the ground with a block and sledgehammer. Thanks, Dr. Chris Kaitipis, for lending me your arms that day. And you guessed it, we then pull them out. which is always fun. And you cap the bottom before anything falls out. So these are great for getting a small window into the subsurface over large areas without heavy equipment or excavations. The third method are vibration cores. Let's see if I can get this to start. Where we hook a concrete vibration engine and cable to a much, much longer pipe. These are 24-foot pipes. And then you vibrate them and use body weight to get them down into the sediment. So with these, we're able to get records between 4 meters and 7 meters deep beneath the seabed, which is great because not only can we look at what environments were in place at the time the sites were built, but we can also look at what environments preceded those. And of course, these cores get pulled back out too, although not by hand. We use a 3-ton winch and hope that it doesn't sink the boat. And special thanks to Dr. Ping Wong at USF Geoscience and his master's students for helping me out taking these cores. It's hard work. So then whatever type of core gets split open to reveal the sediment record, of course, and then we put all the cores and the excavation units together in a complicated diagram like this, where there are sort of core photographs on the left and then idealized core records on the right with some dates. This is from Cabbage Head Bayou site where we took a transect of cores that runs, of course, through the site and then out onto the seagrass bed shelf. But these are sort of difficult to read, so I'm going to try to piece them out just to show you some of the findings that are jumping out at us. But you can see here's, for instance, the pound cores and excavations, and here are the fiber cores. So at Cabbage Head Bayou, some of the great findings is in fiber cores on the shelf between 200 and 300 meters from shore, we were able to identify buried ancient salt marsh deposits. At Fibre Core 2, it looks like we got them dated. It seems like they set up around 4,500 years ago, and that they were in place at that location until at least AD the year 65, when they may have been transgressed by the sea and turned into seagrass meadow. But you can see both of these cores, in both of these cores, we hit the limestone at about 4 meters, which is interesting. Fibre Core 1 on this transect was especially interesting because instead of hitting limestone, it just kept going. We didn't get refused, we just ran out of pipe. So with what we know about the transect, it's pretty certain that there's a deep depression just 100 meters off the shoreline of this shell ring site. It's at least 3 meters deep. It's probably some sort of sinkhole, which is pretty interesting. So on site at the Cabbage Head Bayou shell work, using pound cores, we were able to show that cultural deposits, shell midden deposits specifically, are present beneath the mangrove forest. So not only do they pop up above the high tide for you to walk on present day, but they're also buried beneath the peat. And we can also tell by looking at these lower deposits that this site was likely first built and occupied. When it was first built and occupied, it was probably some sort of maritime hammock on a some kind of sand knoll. In Pound Core 3 here, the most seaward one, we of course have mangrove peat and then a thick deposit of salt marsh peat. And we dated the base of it where it contacts the terrestrial sand. And it came back AD 1255 as a mean date. So that's a few hundred years more recent than the occupation of this site. So what that tells us is that wetlands weren't set up here on this shoreline when it was occupied. It was probably terrestrial hammock environment, even seaward of this shell ring. Now on this interesting little shell rise in the center of the ring feature, we dug that subtidal excavation unit with the pump. And I just wanted to show some artifacts, since mostly I'm just showing pictures of dirt and shells. So in the upper portions of this unit, it contrasted pretty starkly with the shell ring. The shovel tests we dug in that ring-shaped shell feature didn't have artifacts, really. It was just clean shell mounded up. But in this central deposit, we found pottery, sand-tempered pottery, crown conch, tools. As we got deeper into the shell deposit, we started finding really large oysters, what some paleobiologists around USF would call colossal oysters that measure up to 20 centimeters. Animals you would not find in the bay today at all. And then what was really fascinating for me is that in the sand bed below the shell, we found a really dense concentration of flaked stone debris from stone tool manufacturing. They're all seem to be silicified coral, and there's a really diverse range of flake types and sizes, from very large chunks with tons of outer cortex that you'd expect to find very early in a tool manufacturing process, and also very many tiny flakes. So it's a little perplexing to find so much flaked stone at a site like this, but it does make me think about that sinkhole we identified through the Fibre Cores, and perhaps this location would have been really ideal given lower sea level as a place to mine chert or silicified coral cobbles for stone tool making. But I'll have to talk to Dr. Bob. Anyway, so let's move down to Cockroach Key, down south of Ruskin, the famous Cockroach Key site. And you can see our transective Fibre Cores going out onto the shelf. Here's Fibre Core 6 out at the edge. And we were able we encountered tidal wetlands that developed on top of, directly atop the bedrock, which was pretty fascinating. In this area, the bedrock is sort of shells and phosphate pebble. But we have tidal wetlands developing there just around 3,000 years ago. It was also very interesting leeward of the site, or landward, at Fibre Core 4, we were able to find tidal wetlands developing there too, but they don't develop until AD 590, which is conspicuous to me because at that time, that sort of post-dates the construction of this shell mound site, right? So that's pretty interesting. These wetlands developed after people were living here and during the occupation. So in the Pound Cores, this one's on sort of the edge of the shell works where it meets the mangrove forest. We were able to show that cultural deposits extend well below sea level. And we were able to, we found that they're resting on top of a terrestrial sand bed. right at about 70 centimeters, negative 70 centimeters elevation. At Pound Core 3, out in the mangrove forest, we found a very similar record, but with no cultural deposits, just mangrove and marsh peat on top of terrestrial sand. We haven't dated this yet because I need to send off the samples, but if you use that sea level curve I showed earlier, it's very, very likely that this wetland peat started forming around the year 1000. And that's pretty interesting to me because we know from excavations at this site that the upper portions of the shell ridge were built between AD 400 and AD 800. So what that means is that at the time this site was the upper levels of this site was being built, let alone the base. It was largely built, when it was built, this whole area you see highlighted as mangrove forest was probably terrestrial sand, some sort of sandy platform. So when you work at these sites today, it's tempting to think about the site activity occurring on top of these shell ridges, right? Like that's the dry land. But with the cores we're taking, what I'm starting to see is that it seems more likely that these shell ridges were just sort of bounded and protected large, flat, sandy activity areas situated leeward of them. So that's sort of refining my thinking. And we'll continue to get dates on those deposits to sort of prove these ideas, but that's what I'm thinking right now. And I'll show a few things about Ross Island. So this is Ross Island to the right and Googe Island to the left. I haven't been working at Googe Island because I have enough to do. But at Ross, we've tested the southern knoll and this northern sand knoll, both of which have shell midden deposits. And we ran this transect of Fibre Cores and a couple Pound Cores. This is Fibre Core 2 out on the seagrass bed, and we were able to find salt marsh deposits preserved beneath the seagrass bed. We don't have dates yet. They're being analyzed right now. And then in this sort of low energy tidal basin leeward of Ross Island and in between Ross and Googe Island, we also found salt marsh deposits that have been preserved. And we have a pretty good flooding sequence here, so we may be able to show when and how this salt marsh set up, and then how it was sort of flooded and became the sort of seagrassy basin that it is today. But again, I'm waiting on dates. One thing that's really interesting about the Ross Island midden deposits is that they're really unlike the other sites I've been working at, because they contain almost no oyster, maybe like a small handful, but hundreds and hundreds of small lightning whelks and pear whelks and crown conchs. So the species distribution or species assemblage people were harvesting is quite different. And I'm hoping to be able to tie that to the core records and figure out what's going on in the local habitats that people are targeting these specific animals. And then throughout Ross Island, in every test we put in the sand below the midden, there are dense concentrations of chert and silicified coral, flake stone, tool making waste, just everywhere. So it's pretty clear that archaic period peoples were using this dune landform pretty heavily as well. So there's a pretty consistent, seems to be a consistent occupation here through time. We only have one date right now. Like I said, they're being analyzed from the shell midden deposits at Ross, and it's earlier than I thought. It's around AD 550. So with more dates, we may be able to figure out with greater sort of precision when people were living there. But that's our first date, and I think that's the first date from Ross Island. So we have some kind of idea. And that's really all I've got. I want to definitely thank, again, AWIARE and the Levett Foundation for supporting the research. I've got to thank the National Science Foundation and Paleo West Foundation for some funds that have really helped out. And of course, all these folks who have, as Heather said, really sort of suffered some in the field to earn these data. And of course, all of the field school students over the last few years. And I want to just quickly say you can follow our ongoing sort of field and lab work on Instagram. We're at ancient_Tampa Bay. And if anyone has questions or they want to help me out with interpretation or whatever, I've put my email up here in case you want to get in touch with me. Anyway, thanks.
All right, thank you, Kendall. Got some really, I follow Ancient Tampa Bay, and I love seeing not only my friends out working, but the really great, you post some really fantastic, like artsy pictures of Weedon Island and how beautiful it is out there, especially because you have to be on the water so early. So you've got some really nice views in some of those pictures. All right, so we will, let's see, we'll stop sharing your screen, Kendall. And then, there we go. Okay. So then we had some questions in the chat that I'm going to go through. First off, thank you both for that. That was fantastic. And we did have a few questions. So I'll just kind of go through them in the order that I got them. So the first few are for Heather. And Jeff Mitchum, you said you had some questions, but you didn't type them. Did you want to ask? Jeff, you want to turn your sound on there and ask Heather?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't quite get the message of how we were supposed to do stuff. But first of all, I'm really happy that you're getting so many radiocarbon dates from out there. That's just incredible. But I wanted to point out one thing, and that is that in looking at the radiocarbon dates from all those different contexts that you're getting, you probably don't want to rely just on those to sort of figure out which cultural affiliation you're talking about here. And the reason is because up at Bayshore Homes, when we were digging up there, we found that the Weedon Island stuff continued much later than we ever expected. You know, I mean, you'd have to look in the article that Bob Austin and I published. I think it was like 1200 or something that we were still getting Weedon Island stuff showing up in those late time periods. So whenever you can, I know in every case you can't, but whenever you can, it would be useful to try and back those cultural affiliations up with some of the artifacts, you know. But I realize that may not be possible in every case, but it's just something to sort of keep in mind. Okay.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, let's see. We'll just move it on. All right. Oh, perfect. From Trevor, another one of the AWIARE and Levett Foundation grant winners that spoke for us in October. He has a question for you, Heather. He asked, how do you think Weedon figures into the late woodland southward migration Tom Placon has outlined in previous publications. Do you think Weedon's woodland to Mississippian occupation is continuous or represents two separate major phases of occupation of unrelated social groups?
I think that's super tough to answer. I mean, I would lean more towards continuous occupation since we do have so many dates in the terminal Weedon Island and Mississippian, but I don't know, I don't really know which way or the other to say, honestly. I feel like I'm not as read on this kind of thing as you guys are with Dr. Pecan stuff. But I would lean more towards continuous if I was to pick one, just because of the plethora of dates we have from the terminal Weedon Island and early Safety Harbor.
Okay. Then Heather, you've got one from, I'm sorry if I messed up your last name, Madeline Met, asks, can you expand on the climate conditions during the middle period of occupation? You mentioned Vandal minimum. How much lower was sea level? Hard to imagine people living there today. It's very swampy, buggy, and dense. How did the landscape differ in the past?
So I think Kendall kind of mentioned this a little bit with the sea level change, probably about 70 centimeters to a meter, I think he said, lower. So just be, it's drier conditions, maybe drought, not to say there is drought, but, it's drier conditions. I also don't imagine how people live there. To be honest, it is very buggy and dense and swampy and miserable. But I think being higher off the ground than maybe a lot of the places that you can access that you might have been to might be helpful if you're on top of these ridges, especially if you're building them up with shell and making yourself even higher, maybe to get away from the bugs. If you have fires, and the smoke's going to help with that. The landscape might have been more open back then. It's hard to say. So I don't have the paleo and environmental info, but I would imagine it's very similar to how it is today, just miserable for us. But that's what you got back then. So, you're gonna make do and get by.
Yes, I'm one of those people that mosquitoes really love. And so being out at Weedon Island is beautiful, but a little miserable for me. So I get that. Okay, Kendall, that was it for Heather questions for right now. Unless somebody has another question, they can just type it in and I'll add it to the list. So we'll move on to Kendall. First off, I flatly asked, how do you decide on an exact site to dig on an island?
Oh, well, that's a good question. And well, at Cockroach Key, we just tried to stay out of previous excavations, which were relatively extensive. And tried to get sort of a representative sample of the different features on the island. Same thing at Cabbage Head Bayou site, that sort of ring-shaped one, ring-shaped site. I'm not trying to excavate too much area, so we just went simple, one test in the center and a test on each arm of that feature. And then we really wanted to investigate that low shell rise in the center. And it's small enough, at that site, the features are small enough that I'm just trying to find an area that's not too disturbed. And that doesn't have a large tree growing in it. So it's easier, it's more simple than you might think once you start looking for a place to test, I guess.
That's one of the key questions in archaeology, isn't it? You're just you've got this big place, where do you dig? Okay, next question for you, Kendall, from Maureen Mason. How can you determine which shells that were used for tools versus a natural erosion / breakdown of the shell? Says that I've seen many shells at Cockroach site area, apparently she lives around the corner, with holes in them, and also around the world.
Cool. There's a lot of different archaeological sites around Cockroach Bay. So the ones you see there very well may be archaeological. They may be artifacts. But you can tell pretty readily at least these types of gastropod or marine snail shell tools, because they will typically have large and smoothed perforations. And perhaps what's more telling is that there's sort of a reduction sequence you can follow where the outer lip of the shell has been broken off in a particular way, and then the holes are placed sort of relative to that reduction. And then also the ends of the working end of the tool is normally either blunted or it's been worked into a bevel or some sort of very clearly intentional shape. So sort of those features are pretty diagnostic. There are some other types of shell tools that are made out of clam, like hard clam, or transverse arc shell, other clam bivalve or clam type shells that are a little bit more difficult to determine whether it's a cultural modification or not. But with these sort of shell hammers, it's pretty easy to tell.
And so, Kendall, the next question kind of goes really along with that. You may have said it and I missed it, but Virginia Ortiz asked what those conch tools were used for. So what makes those beveled edges? What kind of activities make those edges that you can see?
That's a great question. And we talk about, working at these sites, you really do find tons of that particular type of tool. At Cockroach Key, the tools made of strombus shell or fighting conch shell, they are everywhere, and you often find them in dense concentrations, where you'll find in a small area maybe 5 or 6 of them. Same thing at Cabochet Bayou, where they're exclusively made out of crown conch shells. You'll find that maybe we were there this week on Tuesday, and we found a dozen in a 1 foot square area. So you find them close together. So that's intriguing to me. They're most commonly interpreted as some kind of hammer, where they'd be hafted on some kind of stick, either for working wood or bashing open oysters is a very, very, very common interpretation. You often find them associated with oyster deposits. But there's other hypotheses out there. I know that Bill Berger down in Manatee has interpreted the fighting conch, perforated fighting conch tools more as net weights or other types of sinkers or weights. And he has different reasons for that. So that's actually kind of an open question that everyone should think about and we should work on, because it's sort of been presumed that they're just percussion tools. But there needs to be more experimental work on that.
All right, so I'm going to move on. We've got 2 more questions that have to do with your research, and then an actually really good environmental question. So we'll get to the research ones first. From Mary James, I was curious if you were aware of any compatible pollen analyses for the same time periods or locations that you studied.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a couple really good pollen records from Tampa Bay. They're done by Dr. Deborah Willard, who's a USGS scientist. She's in Reston, Virginia now. And they're really well resolved, but they sort of have to do with the Pleistocene Holocene transition. So they are really good for 20,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. And then the resolution of their cores really drops off and the pollen data stops becoming really good. So part of my work is to pick up where they left off in those studies, and I'm planning to run myself pollen analysis on many of my cores to try to fill that gap and talk about what was happening in terms of vegetation communities from from the middle Holocene or 6,000 years ago to hopefully the present, but as close to present as I can get. So that'll be coming in time.
Yeah, that was a perfect question for you because you're like the pollen guy,
Yeah.
Okay, so from Jay Hardman, do you think that the sinkhole feature near the semicircular shell ridge might have been an attraction as a larder for live surplus catch? Both, might the absence of oyster been a salinity issue? Can that be tested for in the core samples?
Okay, yeah, double question. Cool. So for the first one, that's really hard to say. I'll need a few more dates, Jay, to see. Basically, I need to figure out when that sinkhole would have supported a brackish water table. I don't know right now. Honestly, I think that it very well might have when the shell midden portion of that site was built and occupied. I think it for sure would have held quite a bit of water, and it could have served as some sort of animal store, estuarine animal storage location, but that's difficult to prove. There's some good work from Mound Key, where they interpret depressions, not sinkholes, but depressions as larders like that, based on sort of elevation and finding evidence that lots of fish were being processed. But that's a difficult thing to prove, because even if in the cores I find, tons of layers of mullet scales or something, that doesn't necessarily mean that people were storing fish in there. You know what I mean? So that's difficult to prove, but it very well may have been. So yes. And then the second question, the absence of oyster being a salinity issue, I don't know. I really don't know. What I can say is that the oysters we do find are this is at Ross Island. The oysters we do find at Ross Island are small and not in great shape. They kind of look like mangrove oysters, not so much like reef oysters. So it very well could have to, and that very well could have to do with some sort of oyster reef degradation that was happening at the time people were laying down those deposits. And that is for sure something I can look at in the core samples. And I'm definitely planning on looking at that. I just haven't, I'm just starting to analyze those cores. So stay tuned.
Great. Okay, so Jay said that they found oysters as big as a man's shoe at Summerhaven. So that's pretty big for an oyster. That's a really big oyster.
That is big.
We found some big ones out at Roberts Island at Crystal River, but not that big.
Yeah.
Okay, and our final question is more of an environmental question. So Christine Dean asks if you know of any events for cleanups that they can volunteer at or in that area. And maybe if you don't know, maybe you know some good organizations in the area that they could contact to look for that.
Absolutely. I don't know of any events like off the top of my head right now, especially with COVID. I know that those organizations have been trying to make it happen the best way they can. But some of the organizations that my wife and I have volunteered with in the Bay that have been really great are Tampa Bay Watch. I would highly recommend getting involved with them. They have a bunch of really cool programs. They do all kinds of cleanups and things, but they also build living shorelines where you sort of build shell reefs, or you can almost think of them as modern shell middens in the intertidal zone. So that's really fun. There's also a bunch of different sort of Keep Beautiful groups, like Keep Tampa Bay Beautiful is a really good one. They put on all kinds of different events. And then of course, one of the best things I can say for staying sort of in tune with that stuff is to follow the Tampa Bay Estuary program on their different social media accounts, or get on their email list. And they post about events going on all the time. If you get on their list, there'll be no shortage of things you can get involved with.